Good evening and welcome to the McLuhan Institute Live number 38. The medium is the message. Welcome to the headquarters of the McLuhan Institute on a very hot evening in Prince Edward County. I hope you're well. I'm doing great. Say rain. I didn't do an advance warning of this because it's Tuesday night. It's 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Where else am I going to be? And here I am. And I'm glad to see you here too. So I'm actually not doing a lot of book work tonight because later this week I'm giving a seminar for a university in India called Anant National University, I think. It's a design school. They asked me to do a seminar on the medium is the message, which I'm very happy to do. As it happens, this week a Facebook memory came up that it was 5 years ago that I offered a medium is the message workshop at the Picton Library, the local library here, 5 years ago, in which I talked to, I think, a dozen people for 2 hours about the medium is the message. So this is going to be 25 minutes, and I think I can manage that. It's also going to be open to anybody who wants to tune in. So that's happening at 11 a.m. Eastern, I believe, and it'll be on the Anant University Facebook as well as Instagram and Zoom. I'll be posting the details probably tomorrow, so look out for that. In the meantime, because this is my subject for the week, it's kind of my chosen subject for the year, if not the decade, the medium is the message. I thought I'd spend a few minutes with you guys talking about it. Maybe it'll help organize my thoughts a little bit. And I'd chosen to focus on the medium is the message as a central theme for the McLuhan Institute. Maybe you could say it's low-hanging fruit. You could say it's obvious. But the fact is, it's 60 years later, and it's still a powerful statement. So I think that speaks to something. Also, I truly believe that if everybody who heard the phrase, the medium is the message, understood what it meant, the world might be a different place, because that would mean that people had an understanding of how technologies work as environments, and not just on how we interact with them, on a one-to-one or one-to-many basis. So because of that, I thought I would go back to the roots. One of my major projects for the McLuhan Institute with the medium is the message is to come up with a definite timeline for Marshall McLuhan's use of that phrase. And I have the start. I'm working on the end. And then filling in all the spaces in between. I want to have a record, and I know this sounds crazy, of every time Marshall wrote or said the medium is the message in the context around that. And the reason for that is because, as I'll show you in a minute, Marshall first said the medium is the message in public this time of year in May of 1958. And following that, for the just over 2 decades he was alive, he said it a lot more in a lot of different contexts. And I can tell you what it means, other people can tell you what it means, but given that Marshall spent so much time actually explaining in so many different ways what it means, I think it'd be great to have one place that you could go to explore all these different ways that he was trying to communicate to us what he means. So that way, instead of going to an awful Wikipedia page or anybody else, even me, for an explanation, you can go to Marshall, and I think that would be valuable. So I'm working on filling in those blanks, and I want to have it on a sort of timeline with 1958 at one end, and I'm guessing sometime in the fall of 79 on the other end. And fill in all these spaces in between and have it so that you can pinpoint and pull up the video or the audio or the interview or the article in which Marshall talked about it and see the context. So that's one pet project. And this folder here represents the start. I tracked it down to, without going into the whole thing, a radio broadcasters conference in Vancouver, BC in May 1958, early May. And I happen to have, thanks to Dad, a copy of the transcript of that speech. So here in my hands is the first instance of Marshall saying the medium is message, and I thought I would share it with you. Now, note that 1958 is several years before Understanding Media was published in 1964. It's even 4 years before the Gutenberg Galaxy was published. And a lot of people talk about how there's a big gap between the Mechanical Bride in 1951 and the Gutenberg Galaxy in 1962. Well, Marshall was very busy in those times. He formed the Explorations Group with Ted Carpenter and other people at the University of Toronto, and they were publishing their journal as early as 1953 and throughout the years. Later on in 1956, Marshall actually published his second book, which wasn't the Gutenberg Galaxy, but was actually a collection, an edited collection of the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson, which a lot of people skip past. But, you know, not to belabor the point, but it's very important that Marshall McLuhan was an English professor, an active English teacher for his entire career. And in fact, he wouldn't have done the work he did in understanding technology if he didn't have the tools that he learned for understanding literature. But that's a whole other topic. But that just brings us to 1958, a couple of years before Understanding Media, and even before he was commissioned to write the book which became Understanding Media, a report for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters in Washington, D.C. I'm going to read to you. I've got 10 or so minutes. I'll read a couple pages of this speech so that I don't have time to read the whole thing, but I will make this available at some point. And here we go. I'll just read till I run out of time. Introduction of Professor Marshall McLuhan. And now we get down to the first major lecture of this session, and I would like you to remember that when Professor McLuhan is through, you will have the opportunity of either expressing your views on what he said or asking questions with relation to what he has said. Professor McLuhan is from St. Michael's College of the University of Toronto, and I think he was the first man who said, "If you're having a seminar in radio, I'll be glad to do anything I can to assist." And that was the cooperation we've had from him since we first made contact and asked him if he would lend a hand. He is a student of communication, and his subject today is built on mass media. Marshall at this time had been at St. Michael's College for, I think, 12 years. Addressed by Marshall McLuhan, Professor of English, St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. Most of us are in possession of a vast amount of data that we do not even recognize as existing. This data is peculiar to the media. No media of any sort has its meaning alone. This is true of radio, of television, of the movies. It is true of English, which, incidentally, is a mass media. All languages are mass media. If they were not, they would be no use as language. Be of no use as language. All languages are mass media, and all media are languages. Each media has its own syntax and powers for making statements that are peculiar to it. A medium can say some things that another medium tends to say, but it says it differently. The media are the messages. Come on. They are not conveyor belts of messages. In the long run, it is radio that is the message and not what a radio program content happens to be at any given day or year. In the long run, it is photography that is the meaning and the message, not the picture of somebody or something. No media has its meaning alone. Media interact continuously with each other. Today, the movement, packaging and transfer of information is the world's largest industry. The consuming of information is multiple packaged form has become the largest occupation of mankind. The packaging and moving of information has transformed the globe into a community of learning, a global village. Since technology has undertaken the transfer of information, the entire globe has become an adult education center. As an aside, there's a point on this flexi disc of Marshall talking about Wyndham Lewis where he says, that's where I got it, this idea of the world as a programmable teaching machine. Sorry. One way to get at this problem is to look at it in other circumstances than our own, to take a few snapshots of group dynamic situations of past societies grappling with startling changes in media. A useful illustration is the one described by Margaret Mead in her book, New Lives for Old. 2 million American soldiers with the latest technology occupied the Admiralty Islands, the home of 13,000 Manus. Overnight, these peoples, with a Stone Age culture, became Jet Age people. They adopted the new technology. They deliberately made a group decision to abandon all their folk ways and culture. In Margaret Mead's opinion, it is possible for such a drastic change to occur without disaster if it occurs quickly enough. Her suggestion is that the tribe disintegrates if the transition takes place slowly. It is possible to move from the Stone Age to the Jet Age because these two cultures have a lot in common. The culture that we are forming with radio and by electronic means, television, telephone, telegraph, and many other electronic devices has one basic dimension which resembles Stone Age cultures. People say it is oral. What they really mean is that it is simultaneous. Everything happens at the same moment. There is no succession, no long drawn-out process, nor is there any delay in the effect of electric technologies on all phases of life. There are no areas of life or experience or knowledge which are protected from electronic change. Had anybody announced a year in advance that Sputnik would infallibly occur and proceeded then to speculate and predict what would be the consequence of Sputnik, I don't think anyone would ever have come up with the suggestion that, as a result, the fingers would have pointed at the educators. That was totally unexpected. Everything is unexpected in the world we live in because we don't tend to look very closely at what's happening. Sputnik is an electronic effect, and electronically its effect was felt simultaneously everywhere. But this Sputnik is rather peanuts. It's rather Buck Rogers stuff. There are far more drastic and exciting changes occurring than anything represented by Sputnik, and these we don't notice. Still, Sputnik is a useful illustration of the fact that, when in an electronic age, the consequences of change are simultaneous globally. We have nothing in our culture to prepare us for this event. That is, there's nothing in the history of Western culture to prepare us for the simultaneous consequences. The whole nature of Western culture has been the exact opposite, not the simultaneous, but rather the successive and consecutive, in which events are processed by means of carefully timed consequences. No withholding of influences or consequences is possible in the electronic age. Everything happens at once. Every child feels the consequences simultaneously with the oldest person. Every subject in the curriculum feels the consequences simultaneously with entertainment and news. We need types of observation, prediction, and control that are totally new and for which we have done almost nothing to get ourselves ready. And 60 years later, we're still there. One peculiarity of the Eskimos and the Indians, according to various observers and reporters, is an amazing skill to manipulate complicated mechanisms without any previous training. Without any knowledge of the interiors or modes of manufacture, Eskimos have no difficulty in managing the most complicated mechanisms or repairing the most delicate watches. Stone Age men live in an oral world in which everything is simultaneous. Nothing is analyzed or laid out in segments. Everything is at once. The past, the present, and the future are one. They are not separate entities. Everything in the world coexists. Everything that happens influences everything else at the same time. Electronically, we have fashioned ourselves a Stone Age culture. We need to ask ourselves whether we are prepared to fall into the consequences of Stone Age culture. Stasis. When things happen simultaneously, it becomes an intolerable burden to put up with change. When everything influences everything at once, people get very panicky about change. In the ancient world, the revolutionary technological event was the formation of the phonetic alphabet. The consequences of the phonetic alphabet in the Mesopotamian world and in Greece and Rome were of a rather basic kind. The phonetic alphabet has a technological feature that other alphabets do not have. It is capable of abstracting all meaning from sound or speech, giving an instrument, phonetically and alphabetically, which can process and translate other cultures very quickly, but above all, giving you an instrument that enables you to translate into a very mobile form, to translate the audible into the visual. Reading is the reverse process, translating the visual into the audible. In a culture which engages for the first time in the translation of the audible into the visible and the visible into the audible, the habit of inner speech or the inner voice arises, a phenomenon unknown to primitive peoples. We associate the inner voice with the very basic institutions of the Western world. The inner voice is highly individualistic and analytic. The habit of analysis, of arresting mental movements for examination totally unknown to oral people, becomes normal to a literate society. The children of our world who are experiencing radio, television, telephones, and other electronic forms are responding to a cultural form which is non-analytic, non-static, highly mobile, highly intuitive. This cultural form fosters mental habits of very rapid and intuitive decisions and habits that are strongly collective as opposed to the old, intense individualism of the analytic process, the arrested movement of a mind contemplating analytically. The young are responding culturally to a huge environment of this pressure. Then they are presented, in the schoolroom, with an entirely different program. The young today, in the classroom, are confronted with forms of knowledge and forms of teaching which are totally alien to the world they know and to the forms of electronic experience to which they instinctively respond. The challenge to respond is gone out of the old curriculum. The value of the old curriculum is not necessarily low, but it has more challenge. To begin with, it does not challenge attention. But it has no more challenge. To begin with, it does not challenge attention, let alone response and creative endeavor. This is a fundamental illustration of the persuasive character of the pressures from the electronic culture. We're getting to the good bit. The Greco-Roman literary tradition lent itself to static analysis in a world for which static analysis was quite unusual. The excitement experienced in Russia today by literacy is somewhat similar to the excitement felt in Greco-Roman times or in the 16th century. The Russians or the Yugoslavs are experiencing simultaneously the joys and discovery of two things, individualism and nationalism, both of which are byproducts of print. The electronic revolution is rapidly dissolving our allegiance to these forms, but for the Soviet area, this is a new technological discovery. Let me mention what happened before print. The manuscript, invented in Greece and Rome and carried on through the Middle Ages, developed a form of learning which had various peculiar qualities, none of which we really experience today. In the first place, the quality of great slowness. Because of this, everybody understood instinctively that there was only one thing to do: memorize. Up until Gutenberg, reading and memorization were the same act. When you memorize the entire body of what you have read and retain it on the tip of your tongue, your mode of interpersonal communication is very different from that of a man who reads books. The modes of learning, of social interchange, of speculation, differ enormously in a world in which people memorize everything. Because the manuscript is so slow, it had no value as a work of reference. However, the manuscript invited meditation upon each word, reading at many levels of meaning, in many depths and dimensions. They had no feeling for words as flat counters on a page. They lovingly illustrated them with all sorts of strange architectural and heraldic devices. This is coming back and is likely to increase. Even the newspaper, with its peculiar forms of typography, has tended to restore some of the peculiarities of the manuscript tradition. Nothing is more medieval about our newspapers than the use of abbreviations, CIO, AF of L, and so on. These are the devices of a manuscript culture demanding that everyone memorize vast quantities of data to read the simplest news item. These kinds of reversals and kickbacks technologically delivered to us are very common. Here's the gold. Print, by permitting people to read at high speed and above all to read alone and silently, developed a totally new set of mental operations. What I mentioned earlier becomes very relevant here. The medium is the message. The media of print is the message more than any individual writer could say. And when I first read that, I just about lost it. What a moment. So we know when Marshall first said the medium is the message. This is the evidence of it, but also in 2011, when I was doing what I'm doing now to my father's library, documenting and inventorying Marshall's library, I came across this book, a reprint of the first chapter of The Medium is the Message from Understanding Media, and Marshall had written a note on the title page that said, first used this phrase in May 1958 at a radio broadcasters conference, was reassuring them that TV could not end radio. And that's the transcript of the speech, and that is the first time Marshall ever said the medium is the message publicly. Thanks for being here. Good night. Peace.